Are you looking to find out what the best type in competitive Pokemon is? Well, you're in luck, because in today's video, I'm going to go over what the best type in competitive Pokemon is in today's tier list. If you guys enjoy this type of content, of course, and want to see more, leave a like below and subscribe for more content just like this. I know we just did a tier list video yesterday, but with the Direct coming tomorrow, and just all the teasers and general trends, I'm personally leaning towards it being Gen 9. So with that in mind, I do have some videos I'm tabling at the very least for now, in case of either A, Gen 9, or B, compatibility with Legends Arceus mods in any sort of format. So I'm tabling a lot of the other videos I had right now because they could very well be just changed or already validated within a day or two. So hopefully you guys are okay with this tier list. I figured this would still be a really good video, and yeah, with that said, let's get into it. So in today's tier list, because there's only 18 different types, we're obviously not going to be adding in the F tier unless there's something that we find that's truly abysmal. But I'll be honest, I don't really think there's any F tier type anymore. If you ask me back in like Gen 6, I think there's a couple that can make a case. For example, ice types. Even normal probably could make a case at that point, but I think a normal might still be a stretch. But with this in mind, I do think that there are definitely a lot of types that at least there's really no bad type at this point in my opinion. I think that especially all the types that, as of even just Gen 6, were really lackluster types or potentially had very few options, stuff like Fairy, Ice, Ghost, they all definitely picked up. Like Ghost, to be fair, it had very few good options, but the options that were around were still terrifying. Same goes for Fairy and even for Ice to an extent. But what we're going to do, we're going to go over in this category for two different options. First things first is how good is the type as a standalone? This means without any sort of secondary types patching it. We can go over the potential for types to patch it and just how good most Pokemon are with this typing and how they get about patching up their weaknesses. But overall though, we want to get the type standalone uses in first. And the second thing is how good is the range of Pokemon for this typing? For example, if a lot of ice types are typically lower tiers, we're probably not going to be putting ice type in the S tier despite having good offensive potential, because at that point you're using ice more so as an attack, less so as a stab or a Pokemon itself. So with that in mind, what are the typings that are going to be ranked where? So first things first, we have bug typing. Now, Bug, we actually have some pretty good options for. For example, actually, Bug has gotten really good over the generations. If we pull up, let's say, National Dex, which is what I'm going to be weighing off of, considering, obviously, National Dex is the most variety of Pokemon. It gets us the best general history as well without limiting certain Pokemon in or out. And it makes this Pokemon, this tier list ultimately have the longest form of longevity possible. Because if we did, let's say, a Sword and Shield metagame, and Gen 9 comes out, like, next November, the tier list is out of date within less than a year. So I'm going off of Nat Dex because it ultimately gives the tier list as much longevity as humanly possible. So with that in mind, Bug typing does have a few really phenomenal options to it. For example, we have options like Scizor and Volcarona. We also have options like Heracross and obviously Mega Heracross by extension. We have options like, for example, the Genesect and Pheromosa. Arceus is going to be left out of the discussion because obviously Arceus is for every type, same goes for like Savali's. But Bug actually has picked up a lot over the generations. Even in terms of lower tier Bug types, you have stuff like Araquanid, Buzzwole, Galvantula, Golisopod, that all definitely have a lot of good uses. And I know I missed a lot of good Bug types because there are actually a lot of good Bug types now. Gen 7, in my opinion, was a huge boon for Bug types, giving us Pokemon like, for example, Buzzwole, Vikavolt, Araquanid. There were all actually some really good options. So with that in mind, I do actually think that Bug has carried itself out of the lower tiers, especially with Boots in mind. That does help Bug a ton with Pokemon like Volcarona becoming monstrous. So I'm actually going to put Bug in the C tier. I definitely don't think it's one of the worst types. I think that with options like U-Turn, for example, is a Stab, which is an invaluable move in my opinion. It's one of the best moves you can get. On top of also the fact that there are some really dangerous Bug types, I do think it's a type to be respected at least, though I will say, to be fair, a lot of those Bug types are respected because of their secondary typing. This is Pokemon like, for example, Volcarona, which has the option to counter Seals with the secondary, or Scizor that only has a weakness to Fire. So I definitely don't think it's Bug that's carrying this typing. However, I will say there's enough really good Bug types that are really dangerous to where I can't in good faith put it in a D tier at the very least. Next up, we have the Dark typing. So Dark typing is actually a very dangerous typing in my opinion. This leads to some of the best Pokemon just of all time. For example, a Veltal is a phenomenal, easy top 10 Pokemon in my opinion. We have options in terms of slightly less broken Pokemon though, stuff like Darkrai, Urshifu Single, Greninjas, Tyranitar, both Mega and otherwise, etc, etc. We have a lot of good Dark types though. Dark type as well is able to give itself an immunity, which is something that obviously does help with typing a lot. It's an immune to Psychic, which Psychic is another really dangerous typing, so having an immunity to that of all things is really useful. Sadly though, Dark does have some pretty good weaknesses to some common types, being Fighting. Obviously we have Fairy, which is a very, very good type. We also have Bug, which is an okay type, but to be fair, a lot of good Pokemon have it. And one of the best moves in the game is a weakness for this type, sadly. So with that in mind, I definitely can't give Dark type an S tier. However, what I can definitely do is I can give Dark type an A tier. This could maybe go up to S, to be fair. It really depends on how the tier list scales, because obviously some of the good types, they need to be balanced out by having weaknesses to some other really good types. So, for example, other really high types that I'm thinking of to spoil down the line, stuff like fighting and steel, for example. Obviously, steel is weak to fighting. It's a really good typing. Same as ground. It's really good typing. But steel defensively still offers a lot. So, Dark might move up on that alone, but I don't feel confident enough to give it S this early on. I feel like that would be a bit much. But with that in mind, though, I think, truthfully, if Dark had another couple big powerhouses, this would be an easy S tier typing. But the Dark type high end is definitely fairly limited, to say the least. There are a lot of Pokemon that are in the middle to low end for Dark, though. This would be, for example, Pokemon like Mega Sableye, Umbreon, Mandibuzz, which Mandibuzz is still a really good option for Darks, but it's more so in comparison to other Dark types, so it's a huge standard on its own or anything. Dark also, not only that, but in terms of Dark types that are viable in doubles, this is actually a fairly limited list. Stuff like, for example, T-Tar, Incineroar, Yveltal, or Shifu, that's pretty much the extent you're getting, in my opinion. With some okay niche options here and there. But Dark definitely isn't some huge standard type in doubles. It's more so useful in singles, which I think as a whole definitely hurts it a bit, especially with the lack of super broken Dark types, outside of Yveltal, of course. But I think that Yveltal and just options like that do definitely help keep Dark in this place. Dragon inherently has to be an easy A tier. If Fairy didn't exist, it would be easily an S tier. I might even give it an S plus at that point. But Dragon definitely is one of the best typings in general. This holds so many top tier Pokemon. For example, with the Dragon typing, we have options such as Eternatus. We have options like the Kyurem forms, Rayquaza, especially Mega Rayquaza, which is one of the best Pokemon of all time, Zygarde, Mega Salamence. So a lot of really terrifying Pokemon belong to this typing. And not only that, but there's a good amount of these Pokemon too that actually still have coverage for their Fairy or Steel switch-ins. For example, Reshiram is a great option for countering Steel types, and it's neutral to Fairy. Dialga is great for countering Fairy types, and it still has coverage for Steel types. We have Zygarde, which is able to smash through Steel types, even in the flying type ones, such as Celesteela and Corviknight, because of 1,000 Arrows. So I think that Dragon definitely has a lot going for it, in my opinion. I think that where Dragon definitely falls, truthfully, is the fact that Steel and Fairy are two of the best types of all time, and it definitely struggles against both as a blanket, so I definitely can't give it an S tier off of that. If it was just one of the two, I would easily still give it an S tier, but I think that those two types are so damning right now that I can't in good conscience put it in A. I put it above A. Electric type, honestly, I'm going to give this a C tier as well. I know that we're hovering between A and C right now, but I feel like this is safe for Electric. If this was last generation with Hidden Power still being such a commonality on Electric types, I would give it an easy B tier, maybe even A tier. But a lot of Electric types currently really rely on that for coverage. There are very few exceptions that can really get away with not having the coverage, being stuff like, for example, Tapu Koko, Raikou, Zekrom, and Heliolisk are the ones that come to mind. But it's such a few and far between list that I can't really give this exactly a high tiering. Even among higher tier Electrics, for example, stuff like Zapdos, Hurricane is really nice on it, but it's really just Hurricane and Thunderbolt unless you're playing on a rain team, which in that case you get Weather Ball. Magnezone more so relies on Body Press, which doesn't even boost off the special offense. So while it is technically coverage, it's a way to hit Steel types and also Rock types, for example. At the same time, though, it doesn't really help much with the special offense because you're going for an entirely different ballpark there anyway. There are some other good ones, to be fair, that do have coverage, but ultimately, I do think the Electric definitely hurts a lot from not having the Hidden Powers, which is truthfully a really big boon to it. Fairy easily gets an S tier. I will say, if this is back in, let's say, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire or X and Y, when there were so few Fairy types that were actually really usable, or even just Fairy types at all, this would probably be an A tier typing just off of the usability of the pool alone. But now there's a lot of good Fairy types. For example, stuff like Tapu Fini, Tapu Koko, which you could argue Tapu Koko really counts as a traditional Fairy, but it is still a really good Fairy nonetheless. We have options like, for example, Xerneas. We have stuff like, for example, Magearna, Zacian, which is, again, one of the best Pokemon of all time, just like Mega Ray. So I think a Fairy type definitely has done a good job at making the pool a lot wider, both offensively and defensively. Fairy type really holds a lot of monsters, and even as far as low-tier fairies go, you're really struggling to find a fairy that is truly terrible. Unless your name is Mr. Mime or Galar Rapidash, you're probably at least usable in some way, shape, or form, in my opinion. Same goes for regular Mawile. That mod is horseshit. But there are very, very few fairies that really are unusable outright. Even stuff like Dedenne arguably has very, very niche use. But yeah, honestly, Fairy is one of the best types in the game right now. It is one of those types that you really need to dedicate a Pokemon to. You can get by with maybe cheesing some soft checks, stuff like Dragons or Darks, but you really need a hard response to Fairies, especially if your opponent has a remotely viable one. So I definitely do think that Fairy is really good, especially because Fairy also has a lot of really varied dual typings. albeit, to be fair, the best ones obviously are all the, besides Cernus, they're all the Fairy Steel types, but nonetheless, though, Fairy does have a lot of good partners as well. So, and also I think it's pretty easy to actually patch around what Fairy needs. For example, if you want to counter Steel types, you just need to give something Earth Power, which a lot of Fairies have, at least Earth Power or Mystical Fire, which helps a lot with covering its weaknesses. It's, especially Mystical Fire, it's a very common coverage option now these days on Fairies. I'm pretty sure at this point at least half the Fairy types have some sort of coverage for their weaknesses though, and even still stuff like, for example, Finny, which might lack a Mystical Fire or maybe something for like an Earth Power, it's still at the very least neutral to Steel, which helps defensively speaking against one of those weaknesses. So I think the Fairy alone definitely does get a lot of props in terms of its typing synergy. So we'll give it an S tier. Fighting type, I'm gonna give Fighting type a B tier. Fighting type, truthfully, was a really good typing. I think it was stuff like Fairy and Psychic being such top tier types, though, and also types that are in the more middle range, stuff like Flying, for example, existing. This definitely has a lot of really high tier Pokemon that it does struggle to beat. However, there are still a lot of good fighting types. I just don't think we really have any top tier fighting type. Like, for example, the best fighting type we have right now is Marshadow, which is really good. It is still a phenomenal Pokemon, but that's more so because of the fact that it's also a ghost typing. It's not just specifically because of fighting, which it's definitely an outlier in that regard in terms of a really broken fighting type, because the next best option you really get is something like a Mega Lucario or Blaziken, which is a decent step below. And unlike with the dark typing, for example, this doesn't really have any immunities. In fact, there are types that are immune to it, so that definitely hurts its credibility, though there are definitely options that can get around this. Stuff like your Shifu and Marshadow can help offensively speaking against ghosts, and Mega Lopunny is scrappy to outright ignore them, so there are definitely Pokemon that can get around them. I think, though, that there are definitely enough A tier types to where I think the fighting type is just going to be one of, if not the best types in B tier, but I think that it definitely is lower than at least Dark and Dragon in my opinion, and there's another type as well, at the very least I'm already confident I'm putting in A tier, that I also definitely think it is lower than, because unlike fighting, I feel like there are, well, unlike with something like, for example, Dark, I feel like a lot of the checks besides, for example, Fairy is a mandatory typing that's really good against Dark, but Bug and Fighting aren't necessarily mandatory types on a team, at least not a majority of teams, whereas something like Fighting, for example, you have Fairy, Psychic, and arguably Flying that are all pretty mandatory typings, at least Fairy and Psychic in my opinion. Flying is more debatable, but it's still definitely a very important type at the very least. So I think that Fighting definitely just is as proportional to how A tier Dark is to B tier. Dark is definitely the best type in A tier in my opinion, and will be the best type at the end of this tier, spoilers, and I think that Fighting just will be the best type in B tier, and it is as proportionally close to A tier as Dark is to S. So with that in mind, let's get into Fire. Fire is another one of those types that truthfully could have easily been D tier in a previous generation, however, I think that Boots definitely helped put this in C. There are some decent Fire types, but albeit there's no real metagame stoppers unless you count Primal Groudon, which Primal Groudon, at least for Sword and Shield, doesn't count, but as far as Anapnex goes, it definitely does. In terms of other top tier fighting types, there are still some fire types. There's still some really good ones. Stuff like Ho and Cinderace, for example, are pretty good. Reshiram and Blaziken are really good, but you don't really see any terrors outside of Pedon, which at the very least, a lot of the other types that are higher up in this list have multiple that are really obnoxious. Really, though, the difference between, actually, that's a lie. Ho is also a really good terror, to be fair. I'll give it that. But definitely, though, I feel like a lot of the time with Fire, it's just too weakness heavy with stuff like Ground, Rock, Water, etc. that are fairly common types, especially Rock as a coverage and Ground and Water as general team types. Primal Ground helps a lot with this, to be fair, though, with the Desolate Land, the fact that it is neutral to Rock, if nothing else. But ultimately, not a lot of Fire types really do help with these weaknesses. If anything, a lot of them stack them. For example, Volcarona is 4 times weak to Rock. Charizard and Talonflame are both 4 times weak to Rock, unless you're counting X, which does actually patch that. Heatran is 4 times weak to Ground. So a lot of these Fire types, if anything, just double down on their weaknesses. So I think it definitely does hurt the typing a bit. Boots help a lot with making this not a D tier type, but ultimately I think Fire type is definitely a much less mandatory type. It's just a really good coverage option. With Flying type, this is again B tier typing. This is one of those typings I was hinting at with being the other B tier, and I think it's a really good typing. To be fair, a lot of Pokemon do have really good flying type options, and there are a lot of good flyings. For example, Landorus is really good, whether Therian or Incarnate. We have Mega Ray, obviously, Mega Mence, Tornadus Therian, Veltal. So there are a lot of good flying types. I think the issue, though, is that there's not really a lot of Pokemon you can point to that are solely flying type that are definitively really good. Torn is really the only one, in my opinion. Well, actually, I think Torn is really the only pure flying type besides Arceus and Silvally, I guess. So I think it's truthfully the thing is that flying is so good because of the fact that it is so well-rounded with its diversity in typings, but there's not really a lot of Pokemon you go to and think, that is a good flying type. It could be good for a flying type, but it's not just because it is a flying type. It's really just Tornadus. And to be fair, that is totally indicative of just the dex variety as it is, but I think flying type is mostly just carried by its secondaries. For example, with Ho-Oh, the fire typing helps against steel types. With Landorus, the ground typing helps give immunity to electric. With stuff like, for example, Shaman, you have the grass typing, which offensively can help against rocks. So for Shaman Sky, that's something at least. And the list goes on and on. I feel like that ultimately, it's just not in the same realm as Dragon, for example, which Dragon, actually, no, I take that back. I feel like it definitely is in the same realm as Dragon. It's just not as destructive because unlike with Dragon, for example, you have a lot of really high drawback moves in flying. For example, Brave Bird is recoil. It's guaranteed recoil, but it's high base power. With Hurricane, it's 70% accurate, which even among the other 110s, stuff like Fire Blast and Hydro Pump, and Stone Edge even, which Stone Edge, to be fair, is base 100, but I digress. All those really high base power drawback accuracy moves, they definitely, at the very least, have more of a chance of hitting than Hurricane, which, to be fair, Hurricane is 100% in Rain, but that's really banking on Rain being up, because even if you're running a Rain team, you can't guarantee it. With stuff like, for example, Acrobatics, you need to not run an item, which is definitely a big handicap to say the least, though there are sets that can get around this for sure. So it's just a lot of things that Flying type really doesn't have some super damning moves. The best one is arguably Air Slash, which is kind of a joke, to be honest. At least for one that has actual usability, because Aeroblast is a good one, to be fair, with 95 accuracy, which is pretty good. But it's really just like Lugia, I think, that gets it. So ultimately, that Flying is just one of those typings that doesn't really have a good option that has no drawback for a good stab, at the very least. Really, there's not a single flying move that has no drawback, in my opinion, that has at the very, like, whether it's through damage, accuracy, secondary effect, otherwise. So I think that flying definitely gets B tier off of that, as well as the fact that it's really dependent on its secondaries. Ghost is an easy S tier typing. Offensively speaking, Ghost is one of the hardest types to switch in on. It's up there with Psychic for sure, but I think the difference being is that if this was like an early, like Gen 1, 2, etc., Psychic would be flip-flop, Psychic would be the S tier and Ghost would be the A tier. But I think that with generations coming up, Ghost did a really good job at weakness patching. For example, we have options like, for example, the Mars Shadow, which can easily handle dark types and normal types for it. We have options like Mega Gengar, which, while it doesn't necessarily patch its own weaknesses, Mega Gengar can trap them in, at the very least try and stall them out with stuff like Perish Song and Protect and Sub, so it can muscle pass weaknesses there. We have options like Pult, which are fast enough to maybe cripple stuff with Disable or statuses even to try and take hits. Mega Sableye, only having the fairy weakness is huge with the Psychic, with the Ghost Dark typing. So we have a lot of options that really did help with Ghost types. And the thing is, too, is to find a really, like, a truly bad Ghost type is actually a really good challenge. Unless your name is Bennett, you can find a use for every single Ghost type, in my opinion. Unless your name is Bennett or Mega Bennett, then you're kind of fucked. But for any fully evolved Ghost type, it is really hard to actually find to not find a use for it. You need to be trying, in my opinion. So I think that Ghost type as well just has a lot of good options, which types, even just like Fairy, for example, has multiple bad options. For Ghost, I would truly argue just ban it for fully evolved Pokemon. It's really just ban it. Even stuff like Drifloon, which are really not good options, have stuff like Burden, for example. Dynamax is pretty cool. So you have options on those Pokemon, albeit cheesier, but they still exist. With that said, though, Ghost is an easy S tier typing. It's gotten phenomenal over the generations, and I would not be shocked if maybe in Gen 9 or even Gen 10, we saw that Ghost was the definitive best typing, depending on what Pokemon are allowed or maybe how metagame changes. But right now, I think that Ghost is definitely at least top 3. Next up is Grass. Grass ultimately definitely gets a B tier. I think that Grass definitely is something that, again, has gotten better through the generations with stuff like, for example, Grassy Terrain, which is really nice for it to help weaken ground types, making it an even more reliable ground switch in. On top of this as well, the Grass type pool just got a lot better with stuff like, for example, Rillaboom, Kartana as an offensive Grass. We have stuff like Ferrothorn joining and Mega Venusaur as well for defensively speaking. I think that the one issue that Grass has actually is that some of the best typings for Grass really don't want to switch in reliably in ground attacks. And what I mean by this is, for example, Ferrothorn and Kartana are both neutral to ground, so a really strong offensive ground type could at least wear it down enough over time, especially without Ferrothorn having reliable recovery. And the fact that Kartana, while it does have recovery, isn't usually able to run it. With stuff like Among Us and Venusaur Mega, for example, they're neutral. So again, a really hard ground type could pressure these pretty well. So I think it definitely hurts the typing, and a lot of the ones that are resistances aren't exactly the best. But the typing as a whole has definitely improved a lot. And I think at the very least, while it is the weakest type we have in B so far, I think that it has a lot more usability and stuff like Fire, Electric, and Bug currently do. So I think that as a whole, Grass actually has improved a lot, and I think it's at the very least a low-end B, though depending on the tier list scales, I might move it down to C. It really just depends. Ground is an easy A tier typing, albeit I think you can make a case for Ground in S tier. However, I think that at the very least, Ground, a lot of Pokemon have caught up to this. For example, with Grass getting a lot better, with Ice being a phenomenal coverage option and being a lot more used as a coverage option. We have options like Water, which is an arguably mandatory typing. I think that ground definitely has caught up with power creep at the very least, and definitely has gotten a little bit worse in quality, though it is still definitely fairly mandatory typing. Just like with dark, you really do need this because of other top tier typings. For example, ground is, well, ground less for top tier typings, more so just to help round out the lower tier range, and because ground is usually just a hard type to switch in on. It's why I think that, for example, stuff like grass is a bit more mandatory now, because especially with any sort of format where you know that the top tier is going to be a grass type, or a ground flying type, I should say, a lot of ground types are opting to run, let's say, Smackdown, Zygarde's case has arrows, or in Lander's case even, potentially gravity, to help try and counter these flying types. So I think that helps definitely a lot with also ground's issue with flying. With that in mind, I'm actually going to move it to the front. I think it is actually better than dark now that I'm thinking about it out loud. There's a lot of really good ground types too. For example, we have an Ubers, stuff like Groudon, whether primal or otherwise. Zygarde, complete obviously. Arceus, again, I'm not counting Arceus, but to be fair, this is one of the best Arceus typings to Ground's credit at the very least. Because Ground is just that good of a typing. As far as OU, we have some of the best Pokemon in the tier, being like Lander's Therian, Gliscor, Garchomp, all really good options. Ground also has some really good options defensively speaking, stuff like, for example, Swampert, Gastrodon, which only have one weakness to Grass. So I think Ground definitely has, again, it's really good because of the paired typings, but unlike Flying, it's not mandatory for those. For example, we have some good pure ground stuff like, for example, Hippowdon, Donphan, even regular Groudon is a good ground, especially in Sword and Shield, and whether singles or doubles. So I think that ground definitely doesn't rely on its double typings, unlike Flying does. So I think that ground definitely does have a lot going for it in that regard, in my opinion. Also, Earthquake is just one of the most spammable moves in the game. It's easily a top 5 option. So yeah, easy A tier. With that said, next up is Ice type, and Ice definitely does get a D tier. Albeit, Ice has gotten a lot better, but we're still kind of missing some really good top tier Ice types. To put it in perspective, we do have some good ones as far as OU goes, being stuff like Kyurem, Weavile, Mamoswine, but that's really all we get. In terms of even Ubers, the Ice types we get, albeit they're really good for just a general statement, but as far as the metagame goes, they're kind of underwhelming. Really, the best Ice type we have in Ubers are always Calyrex Ice, if not maybe Kyurem White. Then Kyurem Black is a decent one too with Dragon Dance, but like these are definitely in comparison lackluster for the format. On top of this as well, we have options in the lower tiers that are all really bad. There's not some really good middle ground Ice types. A lot of them are either just really shit, or they're kind of usable. Glacier is an okay one. Glacier is probably as good of a middle ground Ice type as you can get, in my opinion. Same as like Avalugg and, to an extent, Articuno, but not really. Also Frostlass. Frost is the other one I meant to mention. But a lot of the ice types sit at the lower end. You're typically grabbing an Ice type in a draft format for a lower tier. For a Smogon tier, you're typically grabbing it in like an NUP tier, unless your name is like a Frostlass or maybe a Glacier in an NU Trickum team. Well, actually, that's still NU. But the point is, though, is there's not a lot of really good upper tier Ice types. It's the type that really struggles because of how bad it is defensively. I think it's truthfully one of the 2 types that will end up in D tier by the end of this list. So if you were wondering where all the D tier types were, they're coming. They're coming. Next up is Normal. Normal is definitely a B tier typing. I feel like Normal definitely gets a lot of flack because it's not a type that hits anything super effectively, but defensively speaking, this is only weak to one type, being Fighting. It's immune to Ghost, which is one of the best typings we have on here. On top of that as well, Normal types are usually blessed with really good coverage, and while there's not some super definitively top tier Normal types, at the same time, there's a lot of really good middle ones, in my opinion. For example, Megalop is a really top tier one, but it's offensively speaking. Blissey and Chansey are really good defensively. Kang is a really good one. Obviously, this is the original Arceus, but again, not including in tiering, but objectively, that is probably the best on paper Arceus. We have stuff like, for example, in the lower end, stuff like in DD, we have a Mega Audino, which Mega Audino is actually a lower end for sure, to be fair. We have Obscene Pidgeot form for Mega specifically. Staraptor's a good one. Ursaring's an okay one. So while we have a lot of lower tier options, they're viable. They're really viable, and unlike Ice, for example, they're not struggling as much. And I think as well that Normal's real benefit is the coverage thing. This is definitely a type that, on paper, at least benefits a lot in like the RU sort of tiers, in my opinion. And for VGC standards, we do still have some really good standout ones, like in DD, for example, being an immunity to Calyrex Ice, which is actually huge for the Psychic typing. You can also give Psychics a really good option with Terrain while not worrying about Calyrex, which is one of its worst matchups on paper as a type. So I definitely gotta give Normal credit there. Albeit, it is probably the weakest type we have in B. I think it will end up being the weakest type we have in B, but it is still a really good one in my opinion. Next up, we have Poison. Poison, I'm going to give C tier, but I'm going to put it in the front of C. In my opinion, Poison is not that mandatory of a typing, albeit it's really good, I think, from a counter team perspective. It is a really good typing, and if we were doing just a draft league tier list for types, this would probably be a high B, maybe even a low A, considering the Toxic Spike community is really good, and just making sure you obviously have the Toxic Switch is really good. but when you're just talking about general ladders, this isn't really a typing that you're seeing a lot of. And I feel like it's pretty prevalent just if you look at the top tier Pokemon. For example, if we pull up OU Poisons, let's say, the only one is Toxapex. Gengar is a really good one, to be fair. It's borderline OU. Same as Slowking Galar. It's, again, another borderline OU one, if not OU, depending on the metagame. This is specifically off the Natnix list, to be fair. I think that both are actually OU in Sword and Shield. But they're not Pokemon you typically... Like, Poison is not a type you typically see ransacking metagame, unless it's BSP Gengar. But otherwise, you're typically not seeing it like that. So, I think with that in mind, really the biggest thing that Poison has for it to put it in the front of the tier is, one, T-Spec community is pretty good, and two, the fact that it's good against Fairy typing. But ultimately, that Poison is definitely a more lackluster typing, in my personal opinion. Mostly just due to the Pokemon pool. Poison doesn't really have any top tiers outside of Eternatus and Mega Gengar, which they're really good options, to be fair, but ultimately, I definitely do think that Poison struggles a lot from having something that truly can abuse the Poison typing outside of Etern, to be fair. So I definitely gotta give it C. I think in an encounter team, though, this would be a high B, maybe even a low A, because of the top spec community being really good from a prep perspective. But I think the general ladders definitely weigh it down a lot, in my opinion. Psychic typing, this is the third S tier type. Well, actually, yeah, this is the third S tier type. Well, no. I'm putting this in high A. As I mentioned, third S tier is Steel, by the way, but I'll get into that in a bit. But Psychic is probably going to be the highest A tier. This is a type that generally is a really high tier typing. If we look through the generations, Psychic is definitely one of those typings that got worse, but not really. Psychic is truthfully only worse because of the fact that Dark type quality got up so much. If we were talking about like Gen 2 or even Gen 3, really the only good Dark types you had were stuff like T-Tar. At that point, Houndoom was a good Dark type, to be fair, because of the physical special split not existing. And then Umbreon was an okay one, but realistically though, Dark type quality shot up a lot, and I think as well Ghost type quality shot up a lot, so it hurts Psychic as a type. It is still really good typing though. It's great at switching and fighting, for example. It's great at just being a general fat defensive typing. Usually a lot of Psychic types get some really good coverage options, abilities, stats, you name it. And it's a really spammable typing too, because you're really only hindered by Steels and Dark types, and that's pretty much it. So, as a type, well, I guess other Psychics too, to be fair, but as a type, it's a pretty obnoxious offensive typing. And not only that, but if you look at, for example, Steel types, typically you'll have a lot of coverage on Psychics, stuff like Focus Blast, Aura Sphere, Mystical Fire, so you have coverage there. I think this is probably going to end up being the best A tier typing. I can't imagine that any of these three, in fact, spoilers, none of these three will actually pass. I know where they're going for a fact, but I'll get into that in a bit. But Psychic definitely has a lot of versatility to it too. There's some really good offensive, defensive ones. This probably would have been lower A, but still in A tier, to be fair, if not for Psychic Train. I think it was a definitely necessary buff to help Psychic keep up with the times. But I definitely don't think that it compares to Fairy, Ghost, and our third S tier typing, which I'll get into in a bit. But it is still definitely one of the best typings you could get, in my opinion. And it's definitely one of those typings that in A is still a mandatory one, same as Ground and Dark arguably are really mandatory typings. Dragon not so much, and same as our other A tier typing, which I'll get into in a bit. But yeah, I think it's still really good typing. Rock, easy D tier. This is the other D tier typing. I would actually argue this generation that Rock is a bit worse, because at the very least, Ice has some top tier threats. If we look at Rock types though, to put in perspective how bad Rock is this generation, the best Rock type besides an Arceus form would probably be Diancie or T-Tar. Just to put into perspective how bad the typing is this generation. Other contenders, I guess, for that slot would be like Terrakion, Mega Arrow, stuff like that. But ultimately, there aren't a lot of good Rock types. It's a pretty terrible typing, actually. And I would be inclined to put this in D if there was enough defensively that could go for Ice. I just think that this is more an issue with the fact that Rock doesn't have a lot going for it Pokemon-wise, whereas Ice doesn't have a lot going for it type-wise. So I feel like that they have enough to balance each other out to keep them both in D. But yeah. Lastly, I'm going to put these two in their types because I did confirm we had an S and an A. Steel's S, Water's A. The reason being is Water has so many Pokemon in it that it can influence the type to just inherently be good. It's the most common type possible in the game. So inherently, there's going to be a lot of good ones. I think that ultimately that Water is definitely becoming less of a mandatory typing on teams, albeit it's one of those types that it's kind of hard to miss because of how many other good typings there are that happen to be Water types for Pokemon. This is, for example, if you're covering your Fairy Tapu Fini, you're going to have a Water type from that. If you're covering your ground through something like a Swampert or a Seismitoad, you're going to have your Water inherently through that. So it's a lot of stuff like that where Water just circumstantially is on a lot of good Pokemon. But I feel like that, similar to stuff like a Dragon, you're not necessarily required to have a Dragon these days. And I feel like a lot of teams, definitely, especially in the latter metagames, are shying away to a degree from Water. To be fair, Series 12 has given that statement definitely a lot less credibility because of Kyogre being one of the best Pokemon. But that's a whole nother point, in my opinion. But generally though, unless your name is Kyogre, you're really not drafting or using a Pokemon for it specifically to water typing. There are a few exceptions though, so like for example Ashgram with Hydro Pump specs, Dragovish with Fish's Rend, but typically though, it's more so the fact that it's a good typing to balance out a second, and with something like for example Flying, where it's not necessarily mandatory to have, because there are some good pure waters. As I said, Kyogre's great, Blastoise is also a really good one to be fair, Manaphy is another great one, but this is definitely a type that's padded up a bit, and it just more so you coincidentally have a water type. You don't necessarily go to your way to get one though. And with Steel though, this is definitely one of those types that really counterbalances the top three. Steel and Fairy are up here because Steel of course is the best typing to switch in on Fairy types. Fairy is great because it forces so much Steel competition and it's really good for dragons and keeping that in balance. And Ghost is great because while it does have options like Dark and Normal to switch in on it, ultimately though it has a lot of good coverage on typical Ghosts to where it can balance itself out. So I think this S tier trifecta really is the top three types in my opinion. But let me know your type tier list down below. Let me know what you guys think. Obviously this isn't just from one metagame perspective, this is trying to combine them all. So when you do make your tier list, please keep that in mind. That is sort of where I pulled from. That's why stuff like, for example, Fire might not be a D tier typing, because it does have one of the best Pokemon in doubles going in its favor. For example, Dark, of course, in a counter team setting, this would be an S tier typing, because Dark is so mandatory to counter Ghost and Psychic. But in a standard setting, it's not as needed, though still a really important typing. So just keep that in mind when you comment. No matter what audience you come through from mine, just that's the logic that was put into this tier list. So hopefully you guys do enjoy though. If you did and you learned something new, or you just had a good time, leave a like below. It really helps the channel out. Subscribe for more. We are just about at 1,100 subs, and I would really love to hit it before the end of the month if possible. I don't know if it will be, to be fair, but I'm kind of hoping with this weekend's direct that we might hit it. So with that said, shout out to our channel members being Zeke Zero, Josh aka Ultra Player, Randy Champa, Mia, Rika Hashizora, and Pokemon fan Magician Xerneas. Your guys' support is greatly appreciated. If you want to join the channel members below, obviously link is down there. You get a shout at the end of the video and you can claim a Pokemon to be named after you regardless of what we're doing. With that said though, I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, peace out guys.